Venezuela sits atop one of the largest oil reserves in the world, holding more proven reserves than Saudi Arabia. Yet its people face one of the most severe economic collapses in modern history. This is the paradox that defines Venezuela's tragic transformation from Latin America's wealthiest nation to one struggling with hyperinflation, poverty, and mass exodus. The story of how oil wealth became Venezuela's curse rather than its blessing reveals fundamental lessons about resource management, economic diversification, and the dangers of becoming addicted to a single commodity. In the early 20th century, Venezuela was primarily an agricultural economy, exporting coffee and cacao to world markets. The discovery of massive oil deposits in the Maracaibo Basin in the 1920s changed everything almost overnight. Foreign oil companies rushed in, and by the 1930s, Venezuela had become the world's largest oil exporter and second-largest oil producer. The black gold flowing from beneath Venezuelan soil seemed like an inexhaustible ticket to prosperity, and for several decades it appeared that way. By the 1950s, Venezuela boasted the fourth highest GDP per capita in the world, surpassing countries like West Germany, France, and Japan. Caracas transformed into a gleaming modern city with impressive architecture, and Venezuelans enjoyed a standard of living that was the envy of the developing world. But the seeds of future disaster were being planted even during these boom years. The influx of oil revenue created what economists call the Dutch disease, named after the Netherlands' experience with natural gas discoveries. As oil money flooded into Venezuela, the local currency appreciated, making traditional exports like agriculture uncompetitive in international markets. Why invest in growing coffee when you could make far more money in the oil sector or in industries connected to it? The agricultural sector withered, manufacturing never developed properly, and the economy became dangerously dependent on a single commodity whose price was determined by forces entirely outside Venezuela's control. The country was importing more and more of what it consumed, even basic food items, paid for with oil revenues. This monoculture economy meant that Venezuela's fate was tied to the volatile swings of global oil prices. The oil wealth also fundamentally altered the relationship between the Venezuelan government and its citizens. In most countries, governments must tax their populations to fund services, creating a direct accountability relationship where citizens demand good governance in return for their taxes. But in Venezuela, the government's main source of revenue came from oil, not taxes. This created what political scientists call a rentier state, where the government could distribute oil wealth to maintain political support without needing to develop a productive economy or maintain strong institutions. Politicians could win elections by promising to share oil revenues, rather than by building sustainable economic systems. Corruption flourished as control over the state oil company became the key to enormous wealth and power. When Hugo Chávez came to power in 1999, he inherited an economy already showing cracks from decades of oil dependency and mismanagement by previous governments. Chávez promised a socialist revolution that would use oil wealth to lift the poor and break the power of traditional elites. In his early years, skyrocketing oil prices gave him the resources to fund massive social programs. Millions of Venezuelans received subsidized food, free healthcare, and new housing. These programs, known as misiones, were genuinely popular and improved lives in the short term. But rather than using the oil windfall to diversify the economy and build sustainable institutions, Chávez doubled down on oil dependency while implementing policies that would prove catastrophic. Chávez nationalized key industries and imposed strict price controls on basic goods, which sounds beneficial for consumers but created perverse incentives. When the government mandated that companies sell products below the cost of production, businesses either shut down or stopped producing those goods entirely. Shelves began to empty of basic items like milk, flour, and toilet paper. The government responded by increasing imports, paid for with oil money, but this only made the country more dependent on petroleum revenues. Chávez also politicized the state oil company, PDVSA, firing thousands of experienced workers and replacing them with political loyalists who often lacked technical expertise. Oil production began to decline even as oil prices remained high, a warning sign that went unheeded. The government's spending vastly exceeded even the substantial oil revenues it received. Venezuela borrowed heavily against future oil production, mortgaging its future to pay for current consumption. When Nicolas Maduro succeeded Chávez after his death in 2013, the situation was already precarious. Then came the collapse in global oil prices starting in 2014. For an economy completely dependent on oil revenue, this was catastrophic. The government's response made everything worse. Rather than making difficult adjustments, Maduro's government simply printed more money to cover its debts. The resulting hyperinflation destroyed the currency's value. Prices doubled every few weeks, then every few days. Life savings evaporated overnight. A month's salary couldn't buy a loaf of bread. The humanitarian crisis that followed shocked the world. Hospitals ran out of basic medicines and supplies. Infant mortality and preventable diseases soared. Malnutrition became widespread in what had been Latin America's richest country. Crime spiraled as desperate people struggled to survive. The middle class was wiped out. Over 7 million Venezuelans, more than 20% of the population, fled the country in one of the largest refugee crises in modern history. Those who remained often survived by scrounging through garbage, selling their possessions, or depending on remittances from relatives abroad. The economy contracted by more than 3/4, a collapse worse than the Great Depression in the United States. The tragedy of Venezuela demonstrates how natural resource wealth can become a curse when not managed properly. The oil created complacency, discouraging the development of other industries and institutions. It concentrated power and encouraged corruption. It made the economy vulnerable to boom and bust cycles beyond its control. And it enabled politicians to make unsustainable promises and avoid difficult economic reforms. Countries like Norway, with similar oil wealth, avoided this curse by saving oil revenues in sovereign wealth funds, maintaining economic diversification, and building strong, transparent institutions. Venezuela did the opposite, spending oil money as fast as it came in and sometimes faster, while allowing other economic sectors to decay. Today, Venezuela's oil production has collapsed to a fraction of its former levels due to underinvestment, lack of maintenance, and loss of technical expertise. The infrastructure is crumbling. Even with the world's largest oil reserves, the country cannot effectively exploit them. International sanctions have further complicated matters, though the underlying problems are largely self-inflicted from decades of mismanagement. Some recent reforms have brought slight improvements, and Venezuelans are resilient people working to rebuild their lives and communities. But recovering from such a complete economic and institutional collapse will take decades of sustained effort and fundamental changes to how the country manages its resources. The Venezuelan story serves as a powerful warning about the resource curse and the importance of economic diversification, strong institutions, and sound economic management. Natural resource wealth should be a blessing, but without the right policies and governance, it can fuel corruption, distort incentives, and create dangerous dependencies that ultimately leave a nation poorer than if it had never discovered those resources at all. Venezuela had everything it needed to become a prosperous, developed nation. Instead, it shows how even vast natural wealth cannot compensate for poor governance and economic mismanagement. The oil that was supposed to bring eternal prosperity instead brought the country to its knees, a cautionary tale that resonates far beyond Venezuela's borders.